A fresh perspective on the origins of inequality and human history. We're conditioned to believe that when our ancestors first developed agriculture in that region of the world thousands of years ago, it put in motion a series of events that would eventually mold our modern world in a specific way and along a specific route. Our forefathers purportedly formed new bonds with the land they lived on by producing wheat. Individual property was created. The need to defend it follows suit. New work requirements came along with new potential for some people to amass surpluses, binding the majority of people to a demanding schedule of tending their crops while a fortunate few had independence and the time to do other things. To reason, experiment, and lay the groundwork for what we call civilization. Then, according to this well-known tale, populations exploded, villages evolved into towns, and towns eventually became cities. With the advent of cities, our species was locked on a well-known trajectory of development in which spiraling populations and technological advancement were linked with the kinds of terrible inequalities we see all around us today. But, as anybody can perceive, you, who's taken a gander at the proof from the Center East, barely anything of what I've recently been talking about is valid. Furthermore, the results I will propose are very significant. As a matter of fact, what occurred after the development of horticulture close to quite a while back, is an extensive stretch of around an additional 4,000 years where towns to a great extent remain towns. Also, really there's tiny proof for the development of inflexible social classes, which isn't to say that nothing occurred. Over those 4,000 years, innovative change really continued apace. Without rulers, without organizations, without standing militaries, these early cultivating populaces encouraged the improvement of numerical information, high-level metallurgy. They figured out how to develop olives, plants, and date palms. They created raised bread, brew, and they created material advances, the potter's wheel, the sail. Furthermore, they spread these developments all over, from the shores of the eastern Mediterranean, up to the Dark Ocean, and from the Persian Bay, as far as possible over to the mountains of Kurdistan, where our unearthings were occurring. This lengthy span of human history has been referred to by me, half humorously, as the first global community. Because people were able to do all of these things without creating centers of influence or elevating a class of enduring leaders above everyone else, social breakthroughs are equally as astonishing as technological ones. Strangely enough, the culture that is currently erupting is not what we typically refer to as civilization. Instead, that word is typically used to refer to cultures that develop thousands of years later and are incredibly unequal. Dynastic Mesopotamia, Egypt during the time of the pharaohs. Rome the Great. Societies that had a strong class structure. So, to sum up, I've always thought that our conception of civilization is fundamentally quite strange, something that leaves us speechless and tongue-tied. When we consider that humans have existed for thousands of years and have done things like practice agriculture and develop new technology without oppressing or fully utilizing one another. Why don't we use better terminology? Where is our vocabulary for those vast periods of human history when we weren't acting in that way? I extensively collaborated with the late, brilliant anthropologist David Graeber over the past 10 years or more to answer some of these questions. However, we conducted it on a much bigger scale because, in our opinion as anthropologists and archaeologists, this conflict between theory and fact, between the widely accepted account of human history and the available evidence, is not simply limited to the early Middle East. Everything is erroneous, including the historical narrative we have been telling for many years. I'll attempt to provide a couple additional justifications now. How about we return to a portion of those center ideas, the steady reference focuses around which we've been coordinating and organizing how we might interpret world history for many years. Take, for example, that idea that for the vast majority of its set of experiences, the human species lived in minuscule libertarian groups of tracker finders, until the coming of horticulture introduced another period of imbalance. Or on the other hand, the thought that with the appearance of urban areas came social classes, holy lords and voracious oligarchs stomping all over every other person. All from our absolute first history illustrations, we're instructed to trust that our cutting-edge world, with its benefits and conveniences, current medical services, space travel, everything that are great and invigorating, could never exist without that unique grouping of mankind into increasingly large units and the tenacious development of disparities that accompanied it. Imbalance, we're educated to accept, was the vital cost of development. What are we to make of the early Middle East, then, if such is the case? Perhaps one might say that there was only a 4,000-year delay before all of these changes occurred. It was inevitable that inequality would develop. Just a matter of time, really. And perhaps the remainder of the narrative still holds true for people in other continents. Indeed, we should ponder what we can really express today about the beginning of urban communities. Clearly, you could think, with the presence of urban areas came the presence of social classes. Contemplate old Egypt with its pyramid sanctuaries. Or on the other hand, Shang China with its sumptuous burial places. The exemplary Maya with their warlike rulers. Or on the other hand, the Inca realm with its embalmed lords and sovereigns. However, the image these days isn't really clear. Everything present-day paleohistory says to us, for instance, is that there were at that point urban areas on the lower compasses of the Yellow Waterway more than 1,000 years before the ascent of the Shang. Also, on the opposite side of the Pacific, in Peru's Rio Supe, we as of now see colossal agglomerations of individuals with amazing engineering 4,000 years before the Inca. In South Asia, quite a while back, the primary urban communities showed up at places like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa in the Indus Valley. Be that as it may, these tremendous settlements present no proof of rulers or sovereigns. No regal landmarks, no magnifying workmanship. Also, likewise, we realize that a significant part of the populace lived in great lodging with brilliant disinfection. North of the Dark Ocean, in the advanced nation of Ukraine, archaeologists have found proof of considerably more antiquated urban communities returning 6,000 years. Also, once more, these colossal settlements present no proof of dictator rule. No sanctuaries, no royal residences, not even any proof of focal storage spaces or hierarchical administration. As a matter of fact, what we find in those cases are these extraordinary concentric rings of houses organized rather like within a tree trunk around neighborhood gathering lobbies. What's more, it remained as such for around 800 years. This indicates that there were cities with a good organizational structure on numerous continents of the world long before the emergence of democracy in ancient Greece. Additionally, several of them appear to have survived just fine without priests, mandarins, or political warriors. Of fact, some ancient cities did eventually rise to prominence as the centers of kingdoms and empires. But it's significant to remember that some people took a polar opposite course. For instance, Teotihuacan, a city in the Mexican Valley with a population of about 100,000 people, abandoned its pyramid temples and practice of performing human sacrifices around the year 250 AD, and instead rebuilt as a vast complex of comfortable villas, housing the majority of the city's inhabitants. These structures were first thought to be palaces when archaeologists began their investigations. Then they understood that nearly everyone in the city resided in a palace with roomy patios, basement drainage systems, and stunning murals on the walls. But we shouldn't go too far. All of the societies I've been discussing weren't completely egalitarian. However, it's also important to keep in mind that the Athens of the 5th century, which is often cited as the birthplace of democracy, was also a militaristic society based on chattel slavery, with women absolutely barred from politics. Therefore, perhaps by comparison, Teotihuacan wasn't doing too terribly at containing the genie of inequality. But perhaps we can just ignore everything and turn our heads. Perhaps everything I'm mentioning is essentially an outlier. Perhaps we can still preserve the classic civilizational narrative. Furthermore, if towns without rulers had been so prevalent throughout human history, why hadn't Cortés, Pizarro, and the other conquistadors encountered any when they first set out to conquer the Americas? Why did they discover that Moctezuma and Atahualpa were the only ones ruling their respective empires? However, that is also untrue. An indigenous republic by the name of Tlaxcala, governed by an urban parliament, had some pretty interesting initiation rituals for would-be politicians. It was in this city that Hernán Cortés found his military allies, the ones who made it possible for him to successfully assault the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. Periodically, they would be spanked and subjected to public abuse by their supporters in an effort to deflate their egos and serve as a reminder of who is truly in power. It differs somewhat from what we already demand of our politicians. By the way, archaeologists have also labored at Tlaxcala to uncover the pre-conquest city's ruins, and what they discovered there is quite amazing. Again, it is not temples and palaces that have the most stunning architecture. There are only well-appointed homes belonging to regular people arranged along these vast terraces that face out onto district plazas. The study of archaeology in the modern era is rewriting much more than city history. Additionally, we now understand that the history of human cultures prior to the advent of agriculture just isn't what we formerly thought. Far from this notion of people constantly existing in little bands of hunters and gatherers, what we observe now actually provides evidence for a truly bizarre diversity of social experimentation prior to the introduction of farming. 50,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers in Africa were already forming vast social networks that covered most of the continent. Evidence of individuals chosen for particularly grand graves, their bodies adorned with decorations, weaponry, and even what appeared to be regalia, may be found in Ice Age Europe, 25,000 years ago. On the tusks and bones of woolly mammoths, we observe the construction of public buildings. And back in the Middle East, where I began, hunter-gatherers built the massive stone temples at a location called Göbekli Tepe in eastern Turkey some 11,000 years ago. Long before maize farming was introduced to North America, indigenous peoples built the enormous earthworks at Poverty Point in Louisiana, which could accommodate large communities of hunter-gatherers numbering in the thousands. The Senai Maruyama storehouses in Japan could already keep huge surpluses of wild plant meals long before the introduction of rice production. What do all of these specifics amount to now? What's the overall meaning? At the very least, I'd say that holding on to the idea that agriculture marked a break from some egalitarian Eden is a bit out of touch these days. Or to insist that whereas large-scale societies must have monarchs, presidents, and top-down management structures, small-scale societies are especially likely to be egalitarian. Additionally, there are some modern implications. Consider the widespread belief that participatory democracy is inherently appropriate in tiny communities. Or even an activist group, but it was impossible for them to operate on a scale comparable to that of a city, a country, or even a region. Actually, if we're willing to examine it, the data from human history points in the opposite direction. If cities and regional confederacies existed thousands of years ago, bound together mostly by consensus and collaboration, what is to stop us from recreating them today with technology that allow us to get around the friction of distance and numbers? If we can simply stop convincing ourselves that this specific world is the only one possible, perhaps it's not too late to start learning from all this new evidence of human history and even to start thinking what other types of civilization we might develop.